everyone. I'm Claire Allen-Addy, Head of Product Marketing at Irius Risk. And this is the last Diagrammit series based on business continuity. So James is going to take you through this beautiful diagram that you can see on the screen now. And we'll also cover a few questions throughout. And if you've got any comments or questions, then feel free to use the comments or Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I will hand over to you, James, and I shall do my best to drive the slides in a timely fashion for you.
Perfect. Thanks, Claire. All right, so welcome to the Diagrammit session. So today's focus is going to be on business continuity or disaster recovery. So here in a bit, we're going to look at an active passive site. So we're going to walk through a brief agenda where we're going to go through and talk about, why we pick out which different topics of design we normally talk through, kind of what those 4 questions are. And then we'll jump back into Irius Risk, and we'll actually go through and talk through the diagram we built today, kind of why we structured it the way we did. That way we're calling out some of the more important considerations in that process. So, all right, so Claire, let me steal the share from you for a second.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having some issues there.
No worries. No worries. All right, so if you could stop sharing for me for a second. Yep, there we go. Share, and let's do. All right, so we talked through visual, as we're talking about what to diagram, right? We think about visual representation questions. And if you guys have joined these sessions in the past, this really isn't going to be too much of a surprise for you here. But the first question we ask is, is what I'm about to diagram meaningful for my threat model? Does it positively impact the scope for the model? And like, for example, I was talking with the customer yesterday, and we were looking at a threat model that had like some shared security services in it. But it seemed like based on their discussions, they were going to have, 10 or 15 more models, but all of those models were going to have that same shared security services in them, right? Every single one was going to reference that it had, these different AWS security products inside of it. So in that instance, it makes more sense to pull that out into its own threat model. And then, it's part of the model, but it's represented by a project component or a smaller subset without it taking up and impacting the full scope for the entire model. Okay. So, number one there, does it impact scope? Is it meaningful? Number 2, is it security impacting? So does this representation impact security? And this is where, and we've highlighted this in the past with the past several models we've looked at. So like, for example, with IoT, I definitely want to call out certain parts of that design because certain parts of the designs are more, we'll say, prone to attack vectors than others. So, for example, the insecure ecosystem, if I have some device communicating on a home network, I have no idea what that home network looks like, right? So I have to be taking into consideration what I'm diagramming, both with my central part of my model as well as that ecosystem. And we'll look at that today in context of business continuity. Maximize returns. Have I maximized value on this diagram? And this really goes into the amount of time and energy we're spending on creating an accurate enough representation of my model. So, for example, if I spend 10 hours on a diagram, right? I mean, that's obviously a significant amount of time. I'm going to get a lot of what I need diagrammed completed. If I spend 20 hours on that exact same diagram, is there that much more benefit between 10 and 20 hours? Most of the time, yeah, it might get a little bit more accurate, but we probably don't have anywhere near, the full, we're not getting only the full value in that 10 to 20 hour mark. So for example, the diagram that I'm going to show you guys today, I actually did this morning, and it took me about an hour and a half. So about 90 minutes to complete this diagram from start to finish. Okay, so I'll show you what you can do and how I did it in a relatively quick amount of time. And then lastly, we talk about expectations. What do internal, external stakeholders expect? Okay, and this is sometimes the part where value meets expectations, because yes, I want to diagram something, and maybe I only want to diagram things that actively contribute to an overall risk reduction in this design or in this application or in this change. But I have an auditor, I have a GRC personnel, I have a senior leadership member who's expecting to see something in this model. And if I don't have it, even if it doesn't add to the picture of risk reduction, I might need to include those items in my diagram, right? And then this is kind of where we go, well, sometimes you just have to do certain things to kind of play along in that process, right? And that's, again, that's kind of sometimes where expectations and value collide, because sometimes we have to do things that aren't immediately going to add value to our model. Okay. So, and then that takes us into our next slide here. Important design considerations for business continuity. So this will be our last slide we'll look at here, and then we're going to swap over into Arius risk. So when we're talking about design considerations for business continuity, obviously everything we do here is going to start with business requirements. Much like any threat model is going to do, everything's going to start with business requirements. From there, my next step is to determine, okay, what kind of recovery periods do I need? What kind of and that looking at things like RTOs, RPOs, maximum allowable downtime, how long it's going to take for me to rebuild, how long it's going to take for me to recover. All of those different scenarios go together to support my documented business requirements and overall business objectives, right? And then as I go further and further down that lane, that's now going to inform what kind of uptime and availability I need to see in my business continuity solution, in my disaster recovery process. And then I can start to determine, okay, do I need active, passive, warm sites, cold sites? What's my allowable downtime between some event happening over here on the left side? And I'm picturing my diagram, which we'll put here in a second, my maximum downtime on the left side to when I need to resume business operations on my right side of my diagram, right? Obviously, having a multi-availability zone strategy works well. Obviously, this is going to increase your costs, but with more availability, there's always going to be a cost perspective to that. Having a multi-region strategy, and in today's diagram, you're going to see both of those things called out. Having an active passive strategy or an active strategy, depending on how data is being replicated, how traffic's being balanced between two different parts of the environment. And I'm actually going to call that out in my diagram so you can see that. Whether or not you're using native platform as a service recovery products, or if I'm using a bolt-on solution. Obviously, if I have a natively integrated solution, so if you're using AWS backup, or if you're using DynamoDB active replication between different zones, those things are going to be built in, and I have that monitoring that's already there, right? So CloudWatch automatically going to pick up if I have failures in those things. If I have a bolt-on solution, I may be looking to centralize logs from different places, right? So adding into different considerations around what I want to capture on my diagram and capture in that representation, so that I'm encouraging the right design practices for whoever's going to pick this up later on. Okay. How is integrated logging? How are we capturing logs? And again, is that a native solution? Is that a non-native solution? How am I testing it? Do I have VPN throughput? So if I fail over to a secondary zone, do I have a right-sized VPN to make sure that I have the ability to handle additional traffic, additional capacity changes, auto scaling? And then one that I was reading about yesterday was talking about not using overlapping IP ranges for both your active and active passive sites. So if you fail over, we don't have to re-IP anything. We just pick up new sets of traffic, add it to different parts of the network without having to worry about any conflicts between the two and with our recovery option. So, and again, those are important design considerations. They're not necessarily the most important, but as I was thinking through and kind of preparing for today's session, these are the ones that kind of trickled to the top of my mind. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and kick over into Arius risk. Okay. So here is my model. Now, like I said, this took me about an hour and a half this morning. And that was from dropping the trust zone on here all the way to providing some annotations, which are really just more notes for me as we go through and talk about this. So as we break down this model, let's start looking at the different layers. So first off, I've got my trust zone, and I'm declaring this as a public cloud trust zone. And then I've got my environmental layer. You see I've got my AWS account environment. And then as I get past my environmental layer, I start looking at my infrastructure. Okay, so I've got two different regions here. I've got region US East 1, region US West 1. So I'm sitting both inside of AWS. I've also got VPCs inside of both of those regions. I've got 2 availability zones inside each region. And then I have different scaling groups based on the role of those servers highlighted inside here. Then you can see I'm replicating and all my data is being stored inside my DynamoDB, which is then replicating it between my active site and my passive site. Okay. Now, a couple call outs here. So obviously you see I'm using some native components. You see I've got AWS account environment, regions, VPC, load balancers, scaling groups, DynamoDB, CloudWatch. These are all native Area Source components. Okay. And what I mean by native Area Source components, I mean that if I search for them on the left-hand side, if I can spell Dynamo correctly, AWS DynamoDB comes up. This is a native Area Source component, meaning that when I search for it, I can place it on the diagram. That component is then going to have sets of risks and countermeasures attached to it. Okay. And then on other ones here, you see I've got this one highlighted in red. This is a component that Area Source did not have. So what I did is I went up and I grabbed, and I'm sure you guys have seen me do this before. I grabbed an empty component, right, which is a component that I can then attach sets of threats, sets of risk and countermeasures to. I then added that to my diagram and renamed it. And what that does is that, yeah, I don't have a component for it right now, but we're beginning the process of building that new component inside of Area Source, because after I've added it, what I can do next is I can threat model it at that one time. And then what I'm going to do at the close of that project is I'm going to grab all of those threats and countermeasures. I'm going to lift them up into a library, and then I'm going to create that full-time component. And then anytime in the future, when I use that component or I reference something about that component, I'll have content inside of my library that will support that. So that one time I threat modeled it then gets turned into an automated component. And then now you have, that full integrated component with your custom content, with your custom items inside of it. Okay. You'll also notice that I'm using some draw.io shapes. Okay. And the nice thing about using a draw.io shape as opposed to using a component is this AZ1 right here. And you see this kind of blue outline. This shape is just a draw.io shape that I've manipulated to get it to look the way I want inside of my diagram. So I wanted to show AZ1 and AZ2 to demonstrate that I have 2 failover areas, 2 areas of redundancy inside of the same region inside of my VPC. Now, I don't want those to have any level of risk. Matter of fact, I don't want Area Source to really see that at all. It's just for cosmetics. It's just to let someone see what's on my diagram. So in that instance, I chose to just grab a component for Area Source. You see, if I double click here, I have the option to add just shapes into my diagram, right? And then I just grabbed it and said, okay, I've got AZ-1. I can go up and provide the exact same aesthetics and changes that I had elsewhere. So I can go up and I can make changes to the style if I want. I can change the color, change the data flows, change any text values for it. I can make any arrangements on it, right? Anything I want to do here. So same thing I would have in all of my normal components, but then it gives me the ability to layer these in my diagram so that I can have items change the opacity. If I want to be able to see through that box, but have it overlaid on top of something, I have that ability inside of here to work with that. And you see I'm using another one here for my front end servers, different types of auto scaling EC2 instances together, right? Doesn't have any impact on my security. So I'm still able to diagram something without it generating a bunch of extraneous threats that I then have to go through and assess and review, and just creating more work for myself that, maybe not add, it doesn't add a lot of value to this particular model. Okay. I do have a couple other items called out here. So I'm using AWS Systems Manager, right? And the function there is that if I'm making changes to key configurations, I want to make sure that I'm calling out that those are going to replicate between different environments, whether that's 2 different regions, whether that's 2 different availability zones. I want to make sure that I'm calling out the fact that something is doing that for me. I'm also calling out that I have non-overlapping IPs. And again, all I did here was just create a text box, right? And provide some information to that text box. provide some coloring that I want to see here. And you can see that's what a lot of these labels are. They're just text boxes. So I've added a text box here, text box to define, my active site and my passive site. That way I can differentiate if I'm trying to prioritize in this threat model, what's going to be built first. I'm probably going to prioritize my active site first because that's where I'm spending the majority of our time. But you'll notice I'm not using data flow tags here, right? And the nice thing about using the text boxes for the data flow tags is I can put whatever information I want on those text boxes without it impacting the risk or security of my diagram at all. I could have also come up here and said, okay, I've got this data flow. I want to go up and maybe I want to add that I have an HTTPS TLS 1.2 plus, right? And I can add those items to my diagram so that now they're added in context. And these data flow tags here are actually going to start to mark some countermeasures as being implemented. So if I have anything attached to this that starts asking about, okay, how is data being encrypted in transit? By adding those data flow tags to my diagram, it's going to start to do that work for me and pre-assess and start to mark some of those countermeasures as being implemented in my tenant. Okay. We already called out the fact that we have different site names. So I'm using my site tags here to differentiate between an active site and a passive site. I could use things like active configurations, right? And that would be something where if I was using that, I might have something like AWS Global Accelerator, which controls how much of my traffic is being routed from one site to another site inside of AWS. I'm also calling out that I'm using AWS CloudFormation, which gives me a strong confidence that at baseline, these two different things here are going to have, two different configurations are going to have the same level of configuration support. So I know that someone's not sitting at a keyboard deploying via command line. We've actually got infrastructure of code here, so we know we have some level of consistency between two different site designs. And then I've called out that I do have AWS backup working inside this environment. So for anything that I don't have a non-native backup solution for, I have that available. And then I did call out a couple items with my database down here. So with DynamoDB, I believe this is a default configuration, but whenever I am writing to a Dynamo database, it's automatically going to write to the closest database, and then I can replicate that to other regions. Okay, so it's a write local strategy. If I wanted to have maybe even a higher uptime, I could have used something like Aurora Global Database, which uses a write global strategy, where it depends on where you are, you're going to be writing to all databases at the same time, which might give you a higher uptime than what we're going to get with DynamoDB, but potentially at a different cost point, right? So I've called out what my replication strategy is, how it's being replicated, and in what direction I am replicating across here. So with that kind of takes us through, the diagram structure, right? Between my different regions, my different VPCs, my different callouts and groupings here, as well as my different components inside of here. So let me clean this up before we export it for today. But with that, let me pause and kind of, are there any questions coming in from people on the chat, Claire?
Got some questions for you. Some are from me though. That's okay. So I thought it's a really good idea to differentiate between annotating the diagram for greater context and then actually choosing to utilize the components or the data flows. I think really awesome idea to utilize the two. And so I wondered, maybe people are thinking, what trust zones can be used? So is it okay to use a generic trust zone? Probably not, but what are the reasons for that? So if someone is replicating this for themselves, what is to stop them from just choosing a generic trust zone just to annotate what they need? What would you suggest is the best approach for that?
Yeah, and when you say trust zones, I'm assuming we mean, full trust zones. Like I have public cloud here, and when I might use, for example, my data center trust zone, right?
Yes, an actual trust zone, not one of the boxes you're using to represent a certain area.
Yeah. So I would say trust zone is almost never arbitrary. And I mean that because, for example, if I have public cloud here and I have a data center, I'm managing 100% of my data center environment. So I have a higher level of confidence that my ecosystem there is maybe, I'll say, inherently more secure. And I know that's a bit of a loaded term because are we doing things better than AWS in our data center? Yeah, I don't know if with high confidence I could say in 100% of areas we are, right? We don't have near the resources that AWS has, but I have a shared responsibility model with AWS. So we're sharing implementation on many of those different controls. And in those instances, maybe I would say I have a higher confidence that I know what I'm doing really, really well. And I know that I have those items implemented. Okay. So in that sense, I would say, yeah, trust zone does matter just because, the difference between my data center, which I would say is a, trusted, private, high confidence, trusted area. I'm probably going to want to prioritize things that are public facing or internet facing or even in a public cloud over items in our data center. So if part of my business continuity is to fail over from, my data center in Colorado to a data center in Kentucky, right? Versus the AWS cloud, I want to consider holistically where do I have risk at in that organization or in that business continuity strategy, and which items do I prioritize first based on the trust value I've placed according to my trust zones.
Got it. That really helps. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And then also, I'm sure, or I very much hope that most organizations will have a disaster recovery plan already that hopefully they iterate and evolve. It's not just a one and done. So what can we say threat modeling adds to this process on top of that? There may be people watching that think, well, we've already got a DR, we've not necessarily done much threat modeling before. What am I going to gain from adding this as an activity?
Yeah. So we already have a business continuity plan. If we're using a business continuity plan or a disaster recovery scenarios, right, something undesirable has already happened. If I fail over to a backup strategy or to a DR site that we don't use very often, so no one really knows how secure it is. Now I have the opportunity for two bad things to happen. One of which is maybe a loss of availability in my ability to serve customers. The next thing could be a loss of integrity because I have data that has been tampered with, or I have data that has been exfiltrated because someone has left public facing S3 buckets available in my DR center. Right. So in that scenario, I've got potentially a chain of bad things that can happen to me in that scenario.
Yeah, for sure. I think the dogs are very opinionated on business continuity as well.
They have a strong opinion about business continuity. Yep,
Rightfully so.
absolutely.
Brilliant. I've got a few more questions here, if that's okay. So how can we measure the effectiveness of our business continuity plans with threat modeling?
Yeah, measuring the effectiveness of our business continuity plans with threat modeling. So obviously, it goes back to, does it support business objectives, right? And I think you kind of have to follow that through all the way, right? Because if I've got a set of business objectives, now I'm going to translate those into, what we would say is a good threat model is a design threat model, right? So it's before I have an active business continuity environment set up. So from there, I start to go, okay, does this support my RTO? Does this support my RPO objectives, my maximum level downtime? And does it do it in a reduced risk fashion, right? The nice thing about this is that I can still proceed forward knowing that I have some items I have to work on, but I can proceed forward in confidence knowing that I don't have a high quantity of critical and high risk left to be resolved. Matter of fact, if I click over into my home tab here, I think I can actually see that based on the way I've configured my tenant and the way that it's configured to collect my already implemented AWS controls, I know with high confidence I've got about, what is that? About 20% of my total countermeasures have been implemented, and those are the ones that have addressed my critical and most of my high threats, risks inside of this particular model. And that's because I'm already doing a lot of good things well in my AWS environment. I'm using infrastructure as code securely. I'm managing backups. I'm managing identities well. And because I'm taking care of a lot of those high level, high value, low hanging fruit design items, policy as code in my environment, it allows me to start building things quickly as evidenced and demonstrated by my model. Because I have a model here that collects my business objectives, allows me to meet my particular metrics that I need to support those objectives, and then does that in a secure fashion over time.
And so do you think that risk ratings have much use for business continuity assessments? Is that worth including? And I mention that because, of course, we use risk ratings within our threat modeling tool.
Yeah. I think they do have value. Now, obviously, you're the potential that you're comparing apples to oranges, in how we assess risk, because the way we evaluate risk is probably not the way you evaluate risk. So I think more important than do I have critical? It's why are they critical and why are they still critical? Because you can go through and you can reassess and you can subjectively lower scoring in here if you feel like it's inaccurate, but I think it's more important to say we've gone through and reviewed everything above a certain line, whatever that line is, and we feel confident that we've got something that is a mid to low risk. We've evaluated everything that's a high likelihood, high probability, high impact threat, without getting stuck in the quantitative risk analysis area where over analysis paralysis is common in those areas.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Okay, and then last question. Right, we go. So, okay, can threat modeling be used to identify potential scenarios or threats within a system itself? And so I suppose, I mean, I know the answer to this, but it'd be great if you could tell the audience the answer. But if there's a scenario that hasn't occurred, or maybe there is a component or an element that is yet to be added, can threat modeling be used to, I'll use the word predict lightly, but foresee some potential problems that could happen?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and that's kind of where the value of using kind of a semi-automated solution like an Arius Risk does, right? Because like if I click over into my threats and countermeasures, I build a lot of threat models. I enjoy working on this in my personal time, but I can almost guarantee there's going to be threats in here that I would not have considered in a short period of time, right? And I think too that if you work with your risk management professionals and you start working through the different areas where a business continuity system might have additional risk, you can further automate and sustain some of those different areas inside of areas, just so that if you have someone who is, we'll say, a more junior member of the team, or someone who's continuing to build items inside of Arius Risk, they'll be able to generate the same type of threat model and the same type of design recommendations without having to have had the exact same experience you had, because they're leveraging that database of common threats. They're leveraging that database of common design recommendations without needing to be an expert on all things inside of that environment.
Yeah, you can't be an expert on everything. It's just impossible. That's why you
Would
need
be it
tools.
would be difficult. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you very much. It's also really great in the system. We've got things like the version history, and there's, of course, the full audit trail and things, which I just wanted to mention because it's quite helpful to also see the evolution of a system or an architecture. So we haven't got any further questions. Thank you so much, James, as usual, for sharing your insights. It's much appreciated. Those of you that are still with us, this has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So as soon as that's available, that will be shared with you as well. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you on another session very soon.
That's good. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.